In this lesson, we're going to go over our case brief for International Shoe Company v. Washington. This is a United States Supreme Court decision from 1945. If you'd like to follow along with me as I work through this case brief, simply visit studicata.com/case-briefs. And from there, you can just search International Shoe. Case is going to pop up. You just click on that. You'll be good to go if you'd like to follow along with me as I work through this case brief. So just for some quick background, though, before we jump into the facts here in International Shoe, this case, International Shoe v. Washington, is seminal in the evolution of personal jurisdiction jurisprudence. So we do want to understand the historical context leading up to this case, and we want to understand personal jurisdiction at a really broad level. These things are really going to help us understand the court's decision here in International Shoe Company v. Washington. So personal jurisdiction, if we're thinking about this broadly, I would say specifically in personam jurisdiction, is all about whether the court has the authority to adjudicate the rights and liabilities of the defendant. Basically, personal jurisdiction as a due process requirement ensures we have some connection between the defendant and the forum state. Remember, plaintiff chooses where to file the action. Plaintiff can go to Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana, Texas, Florida, doesn't matter, right? Our plaintiff chooses the state where the action is going to be filed. We call this the forum state. So due process requires, well, hey, there's got to be some connection between the defendant and the forum state selected by the plaintiff. Otherwise, our plaintiff could just drag or hail our defendant into any court in the country, and the defendant would have no recourse. Right, so personal jurisdiction says, well, look, there's got to be some connection here between the defendant and the forum state. Maybe the defendant lives there, he's done business there, he's got physical presence. There's got to be something, right? There's got to be some connection between the defendant and the forum state. And so if we think back to the historical context leading up to International Shoe, we have to start in 1877 with Penoyer v. Neff. Right, in Penoyer v. Neff, the Supreme Court held that the authority of state courts is limited to the territorial boundaries of the state and cannot extend beyond those limits to exercise jurisdiction over out-of-state defendants who have not established physical presence within the territorial boundaries of the state or voluntarily consented to the court's authority. So basically, Penoyer v. Neff ties this connection to physical presence when we're thinking about the connection between the defendant and the forum state. 1877, Supreme Court in Penoyer v. Neff says the defendant in some way has to have physical presence within the territorial boundaries of the forum state. That's the only way the court can exercise jurisdiction over the defendant. Okay, and this really gives us three major ways to establish jurisdiction over a defendant. Number one, the defendant could be domiciled in the forum state. Basically, if the defendant lives in the forum state, physically resides in the forum state with the intent to remain there indefinitely, sure, then that court can exercise jurisdiction over the defendant. If the defendant is served while physically present in the forum state, sure, then that court can exercise jurisdiction over that defendant. Or the defendant could just consent, right? Defendant can just consent to jurisdiction in the forum state and then come be physically present in the forum to litigate the lawsuit. So really, those were the three big ways Penoyer v. Neff, in terms of in personam jurisdiction, gives the courts rather, the authority to adjudicate the rights and liabilities of a defendant. Basically, how a court can exercise jurisdiction over a defendant, in personam jurisdiction over a defendant. Those are your three ways. Basically, defendant is domiciled, lives in the forum state, defendant is served while physically present in the forum state, or defendant consents and just shows up in the forum to litigate the lawsuit. Okay, and so International Shoe from 1877 to 1945, a lot happens, right, in terms of technological advancements. Right, basically, it becomes from 1877 to 1945, with the expansion of the railways, a lot of technological advancements, it becomes easier than ever before for businesses and individuals to engage in interstate commerce. Basically, the ability to travel, ship goods, to send money between states, all of this becomes much easier as the technology advances. And as this technology advances, the International Shoe Court, the Supreme Court in International Shoe, is saying, hey, look, maybe we should shift away from the rigid territorial requirements of jurisdiction established in Penoyer v. Neff to a more flexible understanding that considers the nature and quality of a defendant's conduct within the form state and the fairness of exercising jurisdiction over the defendant based on those activities. The Supreme Court is saying, look, there's ways now with the technological advancements we have that a defendant can engage in substantial activity in a form state, maybe without establishing physical presence in the sense that the Penoyer v. Neff court was considering. Okay, and so Penoyer v. Neff, big takeaway is, right, starting from the beginning, we understand there has to be a connection between the defendant and the form state. Penoyer v. Neff says, hey, look, that connection has to be based on physical presence, the defendant's physical presence in the form state, within the territorial boundaries of the form state. International Shoe comes along in 1945, and we're now considering, hey, maybe we should get away from those rigid requirements on physical presence. And maybe we can just look at the totality of the circumstances. What is the defendant's contact with the form state? What does that look like? Does it make sense based on those contacts to litigate this matter in that state? That's kind of the shift we're seeing from Penoyer v. Neff to International Shoe. With all of this in mind, let's just jump into the facts here in International Shoe. This will all become more clear as we work through our case brief. So International Shoe, a Delaware corporation with its principal place of business in St. Louis, Missouri, engaged in the manufacture and sale of shoes and other footwear, was subject to an assessment for unpaid contributions to the Washington State Unemployment Compensation Fund. Basically, International Shoes got employees in Washington, which means they owe state taxes in Washington. They have to contribute to the Washington State Unemployment Compensation Fund. And basically, Washington State is saying you haven't paid these. So we have these unpaid Washington State taxes. So the notice of assessment for the unpaid contributions was personally served upon a sales representative of International Shoe in Washington State. Additionally, a copy of this notice was sent by registered mail to the company's address in St. Louis, Missouri. The company maintained no offices, made no contacts for sale or purchase of goods, maintained no stock of merchandise in Washington, and made no deliveries of goods in intrastate commerce within Washington. However, International Shoe did employ salesmen residing in Washington to solicit orders for its products, which were sent to the company's office in St. Louis for acceptance and fulfillment. The salesmen used samples to solicit orders and occasionally rented spaces for displaying these samples, costs which were reimbursed by the company. Okay, so, here we have International Shoe. They don't necessarily have offices or, storage warehouses, big production facilities in the state of Washington, but they do have pretty substantial contact with Washington, right? They've got these salesmen in Washington that are soliciting orders for products. So even though their main headquarters is in a different state, is in St. Louis, Missouri, even though they're a Delaware corporation, remember principal places in Missouri, their manufacturing processes are happening in other states. But here, their big connection to the state of Washington is that they have these salesmen, they have these employees going out soliciting sales. Okay, so the Supreme Court of Washington ultimately found that the company's activities, particularly the systematic and continuous solicitation of orders and other related activities in the state, constituted doing business in Washington, thus making it amenable to state taxation and jurisdiction for the purpose of collecting unpaid contributions to the state's unemployment compensation fund. International Shoe appealed and the case went to the U.S. Supreme Court. Basically, what's happening here is Washington is saying, look, we have jurisdiction. Our state courts have jurisdiction to collect these unpaid taxes from International Shoe because of International Shoe's contacts here in Washington State, because they have these salesmen soliciting orders in a systematic and continuous way. This is a substantial connection to Washington State. So Washington State courts should have jurisdiction over International Shoe to try to collect on these unpaid taxes. This gets challenged all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The central issue for the Supreme Court was whether International Shoe, by its activities in the state of Washington, had sufficient contacts with the state to subject it to jurisdiction in Washington state courts without violating the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Basically, do we have a sufficient connection here between the defendant and the forum state? The U.S. Supreme Court held that International Shoe, through its systematic and continuous activities in the state of Washington, had established sufficient contacts with the state. Consequently, International Shoe was subject to the jurisdiction of Washington state courts for the purpose of enforcing tax obligations arising from employment within the state without violating the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. So U.S. Supreme Court here says, look, there is a sufficient connection between International Shoe Company and Washington based on their systematic and continuous activities with these salesmen in the state of Washington. That's a sufficient connection between the state of Washington and the defendant, International Shoe. This does not violate the due process requirement here of personal jurisdiction over International Shoe based on these contacts. So the court reasoned that the doctrine of personal jurisdiction had evolved from requiring physical presence in the forum state, established in Penoyer v. Neff, to a more flexible understanding that considers the nature and quality of a defendant's contacts within the forum state and the fairness of exercising jurisdiction over the defendant based on those contacts. So basically, the court is saying here, look, we think the rigid requirements of physical presence is too limited in a more modernized, globalizing economy, right? The ability for defendants, especially corporations, to engage in substantial business activities across state lines is basically increasing drastically. So this idea of limiting the decision as to whether a court has jurisdiction over a defendant based on the defendant's physical presence just doesn't make sense in 1945, like it may have in 1877, where in 1877, right, it was not uncommon for a person to not travel more than, a few miles away from where they were born their whole life, just based on, the limitations of travel from that period to 1945. So the court here is saying basically, rather than just limiting the decision as to whether we have a sufficient connection between the defendant and the forum state to this idea of physical presence, let's consider the totality of the circumstances. Let's consider the nature and quality of a defendant's contacts with the forum state, and let's think about whether it's fair to exercise jurisdiction over the defendant based on those contacts. And so this is how we get the minimum contacts test. The court established that due process is satisfied if a defendant has certain minimum contacts with the forum state such that the maintenance of the suit does not offend traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice. Basically, court is saying, look, defendant must have certain minimum contacts with the forum state, okay? And the exercise of jurisdiction, like once we establish minimum contacts, which is not a literal use of the word, right? They mean this as like a doctrine of law. They're not saying like, oh, if you touch your toe in the forum state, that's like a minimum contact. We're talking about a legal term of art. So the Supreme Court establishes this test, right? Minimum contacts. And they say, number one, we establish whether the defendant has certain minimum contacts with the forum state. And then number two, we also have to consider fairness. We have to make sure that the exercise of jurisdiction over the defendant in this forum state does not offend traditional notions of fair play and substantial justice. Basically, is this a fair forum to litigate this matter, or is it like overly burdensome on the defendant? Okay, in applying this standard, the court found that International Shoe's activities in Washington were neither irregular nor casual, but systematic and continuous. The company had salesmen in Washington who solicited orders for its products, thereby creating a steady flow of products into the state. This constituted a substantial connection to the state, justifying the imposition of jurisdiction. The court highlighted that International Shoe benefited from the state's legal protections, including the right to enforce contracts and access to courts, which implied a reciprocal obligation to respond to legal proceedings in the state. This is an important concept we get from international shoe. We now refer to this idea as purposeful availment. This can be a requirement to actually establish minimum contacts, basically whether the defendant purposely avails itself to the benefits of the forum state. So here, the court is saying, look, international shoe is purposefully availing itself to the benefits of Washington, right? They have the right to enforce contracts in the state of Washington. They have access to Washington courts. This implies a reciprocal obligation to respond to legal proceedings in the state. Okay, you got to show up on this tax obligation summoning in Washington state when you're enjoying the fruits of Washington state's economy, when you're enjoying, you're purposely availing yourself to the benefits of Washington state, the right to enforce contracts and access to courts in Washington state. This concept, this requirement, we now refer to as the purposeful availment requirement. And this is something that you will spend a lot of time, that at least evolves a lot from international shoe to today. Okay, so therefore, it was deemed reasonable and just for the state to enforce obligations arising from international shoes activities, including the collection of taxes for unemployment compensation, benefits against international shoe. The court affirmed the decision of the Washington courts holding that international shoe was amenable to suit and subject to jurisdiction in Washington on the basis of the activities carried out on its behalf within the state. Yeah, so basically the ultimate kind of conclusion here is, look, there's a sufficient connection here between international shoe and the state of Washington beyond just physical presence, right? The interesting thing here is the court probably could have applied a more physical presence-based test and ultimately found that Washington state had jurisdiction over international shoe because international shoe had established quite a bit of physical presence in the state of Washington, but they kind of choose to go a different route. They're saying, look, we need to just get away from the limitations of physical presence. We need to consider the totality of the circumstances, the nature and quality of a defendant's contacts with the forum state, and the fairness of exercising jurisdiction over the defendant based on those contacts. So the key takeaway from this case is the Penoyer v. Neff bases for establishing jurisdiction over a defendant are not done away with, right? Physical presence can be a way we establish jurisdiction over a defendant in the forum state. If the defendant is domiciled in the forum state, then of course that state court is going to have jurisdiction over that defendant. So the physical presence, kind of territorial boundaries, basically defendant being physically present within the territorial boundaries of the forum state, those are still mechanisms, ways we can establish jurisdiction over the defendant. What the court is doing here is they're expanding it. They're basically saying, look, if minimum contacts is satisfied, we don't necessarily have to have physical presence. It's a way for state courts to reach out beyond their borders, right, and exercise jurisdiction over out-of-state defendants if this new standard we call minimum contacts is satisfied. So today, when we're doing a personal jurisdiction analysis after international shoe, we start with the traditional basis. If we're trying to say, okay, do we have a sufficient connection between the defendant and the forum state? We actually start with the Penoyer v. Neff traditional basis. Well, is the defendant domiciled in the forum state? Has the defendant been served while physically present in the forum state? Is the defendant consenting to jurisdiction in the forum state? We still go through that analysis that's more tied to physical presence. But we don't stop there. After international shoe, even if none of those traditional bases are satisfied, no problem. Then we move to our analysis of minimum contacts. And we say, okay, well, none of the traditional bases are satisfied, but we understand a court can still reach out beyond its borders, right, beyond its territorial borders and exercise jurisdiction over out-of-state defendants if we have minimum contacts between the defendant and the forum state. That's what international shoe gives us, this expansion in our personal jurisdiction analysis. Okay, that is International Shoe Company v. Washington, a United States Supreme Court decision from 1945.